I am Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, founder of Afro-Caribbean Spiritual Teaching Center and Children of Kush publications. These two organizations are dedicated to creating a paradigm shift in Black thought. My main objective is to challenge people of African ancestry to think outside the box of Jewish, Christian, European, and Islamic thought. I seek to achieve this objective by writing and circulating articles among people of African ancestry here in the Caribbean, and hopefully we expect these articles eventually to go as far as the wider African diaspora and onto the continent of Africa as well. Then we also publish videos on social media like this one. And thirdly, we publish and circulate books by Children of Kush publications. Children of Kush publications is currently expanding and promoting a series of books entitled Secrets Your Church Won't Tell You. The 8 books in the series are: number 1, The Rebirth of Black Civilization, Making Africa and the Caribbean Great Again. Number 2, The Future of Africa and the Caribbean, Challenges and Possibilities. Number 3, Oreos, Coconuts and Negropeans, Rediscovering Our African Identity. Number 4, Out of Babylon, Why Black People Should Leave Most Churches. Number 5, Fortified Chicken Broth for Black Souls, Secrets Your Church Won't Tell You. Number 6, The Grand Failure, How Christianity Became a Force for Evil in the World. Number 7, Is God a Moral Monster? And finally, number 8, The Church That Changed Its God, The Rise and Fall of Seventh-day Adventism. The 8 books are available from Amazon Kindle Store as ebooks and in hard copy. To see a full listing of books from Children of Kush publication, you can go to my Amazon author page, which is amazon.com/author/Leonard Phillips. Let me repeat that again. Amazon.com/author/Leonard Phillips, and it's all in lowercase. Or you can type in Leonard R. Phillips or Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, or the title of the books you are interested in on the Amazon Kindle search page. To watch more of my videos on YouTube, just type in Lenrod Nzulu Baraka in the YouTube search bar. And please remember, don't forget to like, to subscribe, and to share my YouTube videos with all your friends and contacts in the diaspora and on the continent of Africa. Your support for this initiative is greatly appreciated. I am Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, reminding you that the more you learn, the more you realize how little you really know. Asante sana, which is Kiswahili for thank you. This presentation is an appendix to the previous presentation, which looked at the procedures of the Inquisition. In this appendix, I will be paying tribute to the men, women, and children who were fed into the meat grinder of the Inquisition. Some were dissenting voices in religion, science, and philosophy. Some were women who preferred the old pre-Christian spirituality. Some were homosexuals. Some were Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity under duress. Some were indigenous Indians who did not care for the religion of Caucasians. Some were also Africans who continued to practice their own spiritual traditions. The common factors that united all these different groups was their willingness to challenge the dogmas and practices of a despotic ecclesiastical system. On March 21, 2023, the Ugandan government almost unanimously voted in favor of an anti-LGBTQ bill that not only perpetuates the criminalization of same-sex relations in Uganda, but also could result in the death penalty being invoked against repeat homosexual offenders and in cases of aggravated acts of homosexuality. The new bill also makes it a crime to engage in any form of advocacy for the LGBTQ community or aiding and abetting members of the LGBTQ community by providing spaces for them to meet. In true inquisitorial style, the new bill also makes it a criminal offense for citizens not to snitch on persons known or suspected of engaging in homosexual activity. Should this anti-LGBTQ bill become law in Uganda by the signature of President Yoweri Museveni, a new chapter in the Inquisition would have opened in Africa, and LGBTQ community, like all other victims of Inquisitions in every age, will be forced to drink from the cup of religious and state persecution. Now, I've chosen to begin with a contemporary illustration of an Inquisition at work in the modern world to make the point that the inquisitorial spirit is alive and well in our day, and it is working and walking its way to and fro across the globe like a hungry lion seeking for prey to devour. The LGBTQ community in Uganda will no doubt end up as the latest victims of a new inquisition should the law take effect in Uganda. Now, we already know from previous presentations that dissident groups like the Bogomils, the Cathars, and the Waldenses were some of the earliest targets of the Inquisition. We should also bear in mind that centuries before the Inquisition was formally created, the Church was already waging extermination wars against its enemies. Heretics and pagans alike were targeted and systematically culled or exterminated like the vermin they were considered to be by the Church. Pagan temples were destroyed along with priceless books written by pagan scientists and philosophers. The banning and destruction or removal of books from school libraries in the US in our day is nothing new. Religious zealots have always been enthusiastic advocates of burning, censoring, and removing from circulation books that did not conform to their moral, philosophical, and theological paradigm. These zealots will use phrases like protecting children or protecting the morals of society as their justification for censorship and book burning. Truth be told, all they're really trying to do is protect their own moral, theological worldview. In most, if not all, major pre-Christian spiritual systems, the feminine was always elevated to divine status. All the gods had their consorts or goddesses. Many of the goddesses were just as formidable as their male counterparts. Men and women became devotees of both gods and goddesses. Women were not straight-laced into patriarchal spiritual systems with a clear bias in favor of testosterone-driven male deities. Pre-Christian spirituality had a very strong tradition of feminine theology, which helped to elevate the status of women. Christianity and indeed the two other Abrahamic faiths found it difficult to coexist with a spirituality that was neither monotheistic or male chauvinistic. Now, women who continued in the tradition of the ancient pre-Christian spiritual systems were very often labeled as witches and tried as such by the Inquisition. God help you if you happen to be an eccentric woman, or you were born with some kind of genetic abnormality like a hunchback, if you happen to be old, if you happen to be facially challenged, if you happen to be very argumentative or opinionated. All of these opened women during the Middle Ages to the charge of witchcraft and the ensuing punishment. The encyclopedia, or rather I should say Wikipedia, carries an article that gives a long list of women who were either burned, drowned, or beheaded for witchcraft in the medieval period. Now, coming down to the end of the list, I came across three very interesting names that I'm going to mention. There was a Najima Makima, who was burnt to death in South Africa in the year 2000. Then there was another very interesting name, Amahima. Amahima was from Ghana, and she was accused of being a witch in the year 2010, which is not too far away. Apparently, Evangelical pastor and some of his colleagues decided that they wanted to exorcise Amahima from her spirit of witchcraft. And so according to them, they anointed her with oil, and somehow, due to some accident, she caught fire. That was one report, but then there were other reports that said that she was doused with gasoline and deliberately set afire by this evangelical pastor and his associates. Then there was another case in South Africa in April 2021 involving someone by the name of Sangvini Justina, who was also brutally beaten and burnt alive in South Africa. Now, it should be noted that whereas Europeans have put an end to this nonsense of accusing and killing women for witchcraft, the nonsense pretty much continues in Africa even today. In 1451, Pope Nicholas V enabled the Inquisition to prosecute men who practice sodomy, or homosexuals. These men were handed over to the civil authorities to be burned in accordance with civil law. Now, homophobia has always been like a sacrament in the Abrahamic faiths. Homosexuality was one of the capital offenses in the Old Testament. The acceptance of the Old Testament by Christians meant that homosexuality was viewed by Christians in the same dim light as presented in the Old Testament. Now, it is estimated that the Spanish Inquisition tried nearly 1,000 individuals for sodomy. Many of these individuals who were tried were also executed. Homosexuals, like heretics and witches, were burnt at the stake. Some of them were hanged, some were beheaded, and some were drowned. Once again, it should be noted that Europe, once the bastion of Christianity and the Bible, has distanced itself from many of the primitive and barbaric practices of the church during the Dark Ages and beyond. Unfortunately, Africa and some Caribbean nations continue to cling tenaciously to some of the religious relics of the Dark Age. Case in point, as already stated, the government of Uganda and its current anti-LGBTQ bill. Perhaps the most well-known dissenting intellectual victimized by the Inquisition was Galileo, the famous Italian astronomer and scientist. Armed with a powerful telescope and the data he collected, Galileo arrived at very similar conclusions to Nicholas Copernicus, and both men were convinced that the planets, including the Earth, were revolving around the Sun and not the other way around as suggested by the Church. Thus began the heliocentric versus the geocentric controversy that eventually resulted in Galileo being hauled before the Roman Inquisition. The Church, armed with a battery of Bible texts which spoke of the earth not being moved and the sun hurrying to the place where it rises, sided with the Aristotelian geocentric view that the earth was the center of the universe and that all the heavenly bodies revolved around the earth. The central issue in Galileo's trial before the Inquisition was whether scientific observation backed by sound mathematical calculations could take precedence over the Bible. The Inquisition and the Church responded with a hearty, "You have to be kidding." Of course, the Bible was totally in command in all situations and had to take precedence over science and mathematics. If the Bible says that the earth does not move, even if said movements could be observed and calculated mathematically, those observable movements and their supporting mathematical calculations were nothing more than deceptions of the devil. Galileo and other scientists past and present came to understand that religious dogma was so entrenched that not even the best scientific proof would make any dent with respect to changing religious views and dogmas. Galileo was forced to recant his scientifically correct views and lived out the rest of his life under house arrest. Now, after the ill-fated voyage of the genocidally minded Christopher Columbus into the New World, the Inquisition went global. Jews who had been driven out of Spain and other European nations relocated into the New World. Columbus and his horde of European despoilers claimed the newly discovered lands for the crown and the church. Inquisition courts were eventually set up in the New World to achieve the same kind of totalitarian control attempted in Europe. For citizen converts to Christianity who relapsed back to their traditional religious beliefs and practices were candidates for the Inquisition in the New World. The same held true for enslaved Africans who supposedly embraced Christianity but still continued to secretly practice the ancestral African spirituality. Both first citizens and enslaved Africans were treated in the same way as witches and those who commune with the devil. The penalty, no doubt, was also the very same for those who did not recant among first citizens and enslaved Africans. This brings us to the last category of victims of the Inquisition that we want to highlight. There were many Jewish communities scattered throughout Christendom. Relationships between Jews and Christians were not so good at the best of times. Jews persecuted Christians in the 1st century, and by the 4th century, when the tables were turned, Christians started to persecute Jews in return. Jews were accused of everything, including the death of Jesus, literally. Stories were circulated about Jews using the blood of non-Jewish children in religious rituals. Jews were blamed for poisoning wells and causing the bubonic plague that ravaged Europe. They were also thought to be responsible for many of the economic woes experienced by Europeans due to the sharp business dealings and their legendary capacity to accumulate wealth. Jews were therefore prime targets for the Inquisition in Europe and later in the New World. It did not hurt that Jews had plenty of wealth for the Inquisition to confiscate either. Only Jews and Muslims who converted to Christianity were proper subjects of the Inquisition. Many converted Jews continued with some of the Jewish practices, which exposed them to the charge of Judaizing or being relapsed Christians or heretics. The persecution of Jews in Europe and the New World by the Inquisition and by secular rulers in Christendom set the stage for the most horrendous Jewish Inquisition of them all under the Nazis. We call the Inquisition under the Nazis the Jewish Holocaust. So let's review what we said in this presentation. We said that the Inquisition targeted many different victims. Victims included heretics, dissenting women, intellectuals and scientists, homosexuals, first citizens, enslaved Africans, and Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity. While Europeans have distanced themselves from much of the barbarism of the Dark Age, some of the barbaric practices can still be seen in Africa and in the Caribbean as well. The Church, as reflected by the Inquisition, provided historically the background or the foundation for such things as bigotry, misogyny, homophobia, anti-Semitism, and anti-first citizen and anti-African sentiments. In the next presentation, which will also be the last presentation in this series, I will look at the long shadow which the Inquisition has cast over the modern world. I am Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, reminding us that everyone has a right to make a fool of themselves, but there are too many people who abuse this privilege. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share this video with all your friends and contacts in the Caribbean, the wider African diaspora, and on the continent of Africa. Asante sana na kwaheri, which is Kish Swahili for thank you very much and goodbye.